QSO Today, episode 466, Dave Sumner, K1ZZ, reprise. This episode of QSO Today is listener-sponsored. Only you can keep the QSO Today podcast coming to you every weekend since 2014. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor banner on the show notes page or at the top of the QSOtoday.com webpage. We now have no commercial sponsors and depend upon you, my dear listeners, for keeping this project alive. Please become a listener sponsor today. My thanks to William Gwaltney Jr., WA4GK, for his $10 monthly sponsorship. Dallas Ward, K1DW, $100 annual sponsor. And Sam Tonseth, KI7CDG, $100 annual sponsor this week. My sincere thanks to all of you who support the podcast. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth, amateur call sign 4Z1UG, where I demonstrate the diversity and relevance of the amateur radio hobby and its impact on society by interviewing ham radio operators, many of whom played vital roles in shaping our technology through the amateur radio hobby. And while many people might say, ham radio, do people still do that? This podcast demonstrates through in-depth interviews just how amazing, diverse, and dynamic the amateur radio hobby continues to be. Next week is the QSO Today Academy event, starting at 1800 hours PDT on Friday, September 8th. Listener sponsors have full access to the event and all of the Academy resources after the event. If you are not a listener sponsor, then you can buy a ticket for $15. Please buy our ticket, as your show of support, even if you are not available on the weekend, is good for QSO Today and will keep the Academy going. The ticket is good for 33 days and will access the presentations until the middle of October. We have over 25 amazing presentations to fill your weekend. Please click on the ticket banner on this week's show notes page to get your ticket. At the invitation of Paul Topolsky, W1SCX, I spoke about QSO Today at the Mohawk Amateur Radio Club meeting last Monday. While it was very early in the morning, I'm happy to come to your club and help facilitate one of the past expo speakers to come to your club to make a presentation through the Academy. As I have my head down in the QSO Today Academy before its opening next week, I wanted to bring back the interesting interview that I had back in November of 2017 with Dave Sumner K1ZZ, former CEO and general manager of the ARRL. Dave retired in 2016 after 44 years with the league, beginning as an intern. Dave shares his ham radio outlook, operating practices, and reflections on his years in the ARRL headquarters. K1ZZ is my QSO Today. K1ZZ, this is Eric, 4Z1UG. Are you there, Dave?
Hello, 4Z1UG from K1ZZ. Hello, Eric. You're 5'9" in Coventry, Connecticut.
Well, Dave, you're 5'9" in Efrat, Israel. Thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Well, for me, it started around the age of 10. I was given a crystal radio kit to put together, and I was trying to hear a local broadcast station. It was just a few miles away. I never did pick up that station. But somehow I did pick up a Voice of America transmitter that was about 600 miles away in southwestern Ohio, which had the call sign at the time WLWO, and it just lay there, kind of as a planted seed that took some time to germinate. About 3 years later, I had an opportunity through my father to attend a licensing class that was being held by one of his co-workers. And he would drive me down there every Thursday, and I was quite impatient to get going and get on the air. So against the advice of the sponsor of the class, I went and took my novice exam. He felt that if newcomers took a novice license, they would spend their year on the air and wouldn't study and wouldn't be able to upgrade after the 1 year, which at the time was a licensing limitation. You could only be a novice for 1 year, and it was a one-time only thing. And he felt that was not a good path to go down. Well, I ignored his advice, and I guess the rest is history.
So you got your novice license at age 13. What was your call sign?
My call sign was K1ZZ, KN1 Zulu November Delta.
And, of course, you did upgrade within the year.
I took the conditional exam in March of the following year. It was about 4 months later. It took until May for the license actually to arrive in the mail. But at that point, I had a full privilege license and went on to pass the general exam in front of an FCC examiner and the extra class at age 16.
So you became extra class at age 16, and that was with the full 20 words a minute CW, and I think the test at the time may have included was it multiple choice, or did it require some schematic diagrams?
The exam at the time was, as you say, 20 words a minute Morse, which was no problem for me. I was copying 45 at the time. And the written exam was 100 questions. 90 of them were multiple choice. The last 10 involved drawing diagrams. But the examiner didn't bother looking at the diagrams if you already had 74 correct answers when you got to 90.
Well, I somehow remember in the 70s that we were still drawing diagrams for the general class, drawing the Hartley oscillator, drawing the Colpitts oscillator, things like that.
Well, you probably had to recognize those. I can't speak to that because the last exam I ever took was in 1965. And it's rather ironic because as a result of that, I've never passed an amateur radio exam that required any knowledge whatsoever of solid state. Obviously, I know a little bit about solid state now, but whenever I run into an old timer who says, "Oh, these young kids, they don't have to go through the kind of thing we'd had to do," well, actually, today you just have to know a lot more than you had to back in the days when there was CW and there was AM and there wasn't much else.
Now, did you have any Elmers or mentors that helped you along in those days? Helped you get your first rig?
Well, I set up my first station with some help from my father. He was not licensed, but he had been in the U.S. Army Signal Corps in World War II. He did afterwards, after he retired, actually, he became a licensed amateur and was quite active in a club out in Arizona. He is still November Whiskey 7 Romeo, NW7R, which is a call sign that he allows me to use once in a while in the WPX contest because NW7 is a lot more attractive to Europeans than just another K1. So Dad was certainly a assistant and inspiration, although he pretty much let me do what I wanted to do. In fact, he completely let me do what I wanted to do. My primary Elmer in terms of technology was someone I worked for, I guess the following year. I guess I started working in his radio TV repair shop when I was 14. And his name was Bud Ward, Whiskey 1 Golf Echo Alpha. This is all happening in Norwich, Connecticut, which is in the southeastern part of Connecticut. Bud was the local emergency coordinator for the what was then called the Amateur Radio Emergency Corps, which is now ARRL. And I worked in his shop after school and on Saturdays, and helped him out as he eventually gave me the title of Assistant Emergency Coordinator. Bud was confined to a wheelchair. He had cerebral palsy, and had spent his entire life in a wheelchair, self-taught in electronics, and the deal was that after World War II, he gained permission to train returning GIs in radio and television repair, and he did that for a number of years. By the time I came along in 1964, though he had pretty much run out of returning GIs, so he was reduced to hiring school kids to help him out. But it was a great... Go ahead.
What was his call sign again?
Whiskey 1 Golf Echo Alpha.
Wow, sounds like a great mentor. What was your first rig? Do you remember it?
Oh, yes, because I built it. It was a Night Kit T60 transmitter. It had a sweep tube final and not very much in the way of instrumentation in it. It took me a while to realize that you did not tune for maximum glow of the plates and the final amplifier.
And the receiver?
A receiver, again, it was a kit. It was a Lafayette KT320. That was actually a Japanese design. It was made by the same company that it ultimately became Kenwood. And it was fairly reasonable set of 8 or 9 tubes and a nice wide band spread on 80 meters, I remember.
What's your favorite operating mode?
Oh, CW, absolutely. It's the area that I've focused on mostly in my career. There was a time when I could honestly say that I had done everything there was to do in amateur radio, including slow scan, fast scan television, and so on. But I couldn't say that after about the mid-1980s. And, that's when things began to expand in so many different directions that today certainly it's not possible for a single individual to be an expert at everything in amateur radio. You either have to be a dilettante and try a little of this, a little of that, or you become a specialist. And I've focused on CW DX contesting primarily.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Definitely. I came out of high school in 1967. That was 10 years after Sputnik. So most of my time in school up to that point was spent in the shadow of Sputnik, which caused the American education system to focus very strongly on math and science. And so I was in the math science track, and because of the hobby and what I was doing after school, it just kind of was assumed that I would go into electrical engineering. I went to Michigan State University, and I have told the story before that one of the motivating factors in my choice of university was that the club station at Michigan State at the time, W8SH, which is still active, by the way, at the time had a Collins S line, including a 30S1 amplifier. And so that sealed the deal as far as I was concerned. The club advisor, I remember one day he was showing a visitor to campus around, and he came into the shack to show off the shack, and of course I was there. And he introduced me, and he said, "This is Dave Sumner. He's majoring in amateur radio," which turned out pretty close to the truth, although the degree actually says political science.
Oh, so in the end, you didn't do electrical engineering?
No, I didn't. And no regrets in that regard. I've had a very, very, very rewarding career.
Also, we'll get to that in just a few minutes. You published a very recent and complete inventory on QRZ of your antenna farm in Connecticut. How are you set up, and what do you do with the antennas on your farm?
Well, it's primarily for CWDX contests, and therefore my focus is on 160 meters through 10 meters, 160, 80, 40, 20, 15, and 10 meters. I operate other bands up to 10 gigahertz, but that's the main focus. And from this part of the country, the way to do well in a DX contest is to work lots and lots of Europeans. And so my antennas are designed to be maximally effective toward the Northeast, which also, of course, captures the Middle East and beyond. So my wife and I have 15 acres out in the country. It's rather heavily wooded. We're quite a distance from any of our neighbors, and so we can pursue what we want back here without too much concern about bothering the horses who live next door or anyone else.
Now, do you clear an area of trees in order to put those towers up, or do you put those towers up between the trees?
Kind of a mix of both. If I had to do it over again, I would do a little bit more clearing because trees have this habit of growing. And at the moment, there are a couple of branches that I really need to get out of the way. But I've tried to minimize the impact on the natural environment here as much as possible because, well, you just don't want to leave too heavy a footprint when you go.
Well, you have 4 towers. Do you also use the trees to hold up your antennas?
I don't have any antennas in trees except there are a couple of lines holding up the 160 meter antenna that do end up in trees, but far enough down the tree trunks are pretty hefty at that point, so they don't move around in the breeze. So this was something I just did this summer, and it remains to be seen whether it will survive a New England winter, but I think it should be okay.
Now, you say you work DX contests. Do you work SO2R with a station like yours?
Yes, I do. I have 2 transceivers, 2 amplifiers. I'm able, because of spacing between the antennas, to operate on 2 different bands simultaneously. I'm not all that good at it. You will talk. I hope you have talked, and if not, I hope you will talk to some folks who are much more expert at it than I am. It's a challenge for me to be copying 2 streams of Morse code, one in the left ear and one in the right, but I'm getting better at it as time goes on.
And what are the current rigs?
The current rigs are a Elecraft K3 upgraded with the latest mods that Elecraft has offered for it. The other is a ICOM 7600, which we have primarily because my wife likes it, and she likes doing phone contests, particularly when 10 meters is open. Okay,
so your wife, what's your wife's name? And she's also a ham.
Yes, Linda is Kilo Alpha 1 Zulu Delta. She's been licensed since before we were married, and as I say, she likes phone DX contests, especially 10 meters, and we also collaborate on 10 gigahertz on microwave contest every year. We've been doing this for about 15 years. It gets us out of the house and out on hilltops.
I see. When you say collaborate, she's with you on site, and you take your rig up to a mountaintop and work together?
Right.
I see.
Yes.
She doesn't have a second rig, and you just, she goes to another hilltop.
Well, that would there are times when that would be it would be good to have a second rig. We don't have a second rig, so to make contacts, we have to go out when other people are doing the same thing. And fortunately, in New England, we have a critical mass of microwave operators, and it's been a lot of fun to learn the tricks of the trade in that area. Linda does most of the operating on microwave. I guess I would describe myself as the technical support, and if signals are weak enough to require CW, then she turns it over to me.
Now, do you operate microwave from home?
We don't. The problem is the trees.
Mm-hmm.
Trees and microwaves don't get along too well, and we would have to go up maybe 80 or 90 feet in order to get above the trees. And it's possible to do that, but because the main attraction for Linda is that it gets us out of the house, setting up at home has not been a priority.
What kind of transceiver do you use with that 10 gigahertz rig?
The IF rig is a Yaesu FT817, which is almost ideal for that kind of application. And we have the DB6NT CUNA transverter, 2-watt amplifier, preamp, and at the moment we're just using an 18-inch dish, but that's good enough to do consistently over 300 kilometers when we go out.
So your dish is maybe a satellite TV dish or something?
Yes, exactly. Mm-hmm. It's an old direct TV dish.
Found in many trash cans, I might add.
Well, one of the things that intrigued Linda about microwaves in the beginning, and this goes back to the late 1970s, was that at the time the president of the Radio Society of Great Britain, the RSGB, was a gentleman named Dane Evans, G3RPE, and Dane was a real evangelist when it came to promoting simple microwave equipment. And one of the things that Dane discovered was that at the time, the top of the lid of trash cans in the UK, for some reason, made very good parabolic reflectors. And so there was a whole generation of UK amateurs using very simple gun diode equipment, using dustbin lids as the antenna reflector, and that just intrigued Linda no end, and so that's kind of how we ended up doing microwave a bit more seriously some years later.
Well, I think that's really cool. I think as we, as the more people become cord cutters, where they actually are getting all their content from the internet and not from satellite TV, there'll be a lot more satellite TV dishes for people to get on 10 gigahertz. That's
certainly one way of doing it, and it doesn't have to be expensive. Up here, we're fortunate enough to have cable, so that's why.
That's why there's a dish available, maybe.
That's why we're no longer DirecTV customers.
And now this mid-show break. The future of podcasting and the QSO Today podcast is listener sponsorship. It keeps us lean and focused on providing you the best ham radio interviews since 2014. You can keep the QSO Today podcast commercial and sponsor-free by becoming a listener sponsor yourself. For $10 a month or save 20% at $100 per year, you can become a listener sponsor. I am now recording the QSO Today podcast as video interviews that are available only as a benefit to listener sponsors through our QSO Today community website. As I develop the sponsorship tier, I will add bonus content for listener sponsors. Listener sponsors, not donors, are automatically members of the new QSO Today Academy. That includes the upcoming QSO Today Academy event on September 9th and 10th, 2023. I am building the Academy website to include access to our Sequel.io networking lounges all of the time, even after the event, and Academy resources including over 400 previous Expo presentations with Q&A, and additional helpful ham radio educational resources. The benefit of listener sponsorship as an alternative to commercial sponsorship is that commercial sponsors influence the content and comments in the podcast. Listener sponsorship allows a greater degree of freedom to discuss any ham radio subject without commercial consequence. I have eliminated all commercials in the QSO Today podcast from episode 445, with the exception of the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, as I think that this is a serious asset to a well-rounded ham radio education. I am not using Buy Me a Coffee or Patreon, but my own system for managing the community that could form out of the podcast. I direct you to the sponsorship section of the show notes pages beginning with the episode 444, where I list all of the contributors to the podcast since 2014, including sponsors, donors, and hams who have paid for transcriptions. If sponsorship is not your interest, then you can make any size donation to the podcast by clicking on the donation button on the QSO Today podcast website at qsotoday.com. There is a slider that you can use to adjust the amount of your donation. If you want to make your donation monthly, click on the recurring donation box. It is the recurring donations and the listener sponsorships that keep the lights burning here. Finally, you don't have to contribute anything to listen to the QSO Today podcast. You can use my Amazon affiliate link before shopping at Amazon by clicking on it on the right side of the show notes page. This will signal Amazon to send us a small percentage of what you purchase. This is the most painless way to ensure that the QSO Today project will be here next week. I want to thank everyone who has contributed and will contribute to my effort to create this oral history of amateur radio since 2014. It will eventually all be in the public domain for hams in the future to enjoy. Be sure to become a listener sponsor or make a donation today. And now we return to our QSO Today. In episode 94 of the QSO Today podcast, I had a QSO with Ellen White, W1YL, who says that she remembers a young David Sumner working at the ARRL. Can you talk about your ARRL story and how did it begin?
Sure. Ellen was at the time the assistant communications manager at ARRL headquarters, and one of her responsibilities was finding summer help to help out. I had, at that point, I have to back up slightly. In the mid-'60s, from home with a very modest station, I was doing reasonably well in CW contests, well enough that I had developed at least a local reputation. And then I went off to college in Michigan, at Michigan State, as I mentioned. And I came back from my first Christmas break and stopped in at league headquarters, and we got to chatting, and it turned out that they were thinking about doing some summer hiring, so I decided to apply and ended up working that summer for Bob Hill, W1ARR, who just passed away earlier this year. Bob was a very creative writer, and he was in that position only about a year and a half, but I was lucky enough that I overlapped that. So I worked for Bob and did the scut work of checking contest logs back in the pre-computer days. It was an advantage for me because I had operated both the phone and CW contests from Michigan that year, so I knew a lot of the call signs anyway. So I worked there that summer. As well, it's more than you need to know, but I actually telescoped my freshman and sophomore years of college into 1 year. So that was actually my first summer break. My second summer break, in the summer of 1969, I had the opportunity to work at Collins Radio. At the time, I was still planning engineering, and so I spent the summer working as a junior engineer at Collins out in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. That was a very exciting summer. It was the summer of the Apollo moon landing, and many of the people at Collins had been instrumental in designing the communications equipment for the Apollo program. So I remember in Cedar Rapids, the entire city just shut down to watch the moon landing on July 20th. It was almost eerie to see this happen. I came back to ARRL headquarters for the summer of 1970, which was right after I graduated from college and hadn't settled on the next step. Well, just, to make a long story short, I spent a year working for an insurance company in Hartford. And after that year, I was offered a full-time position at League headquarters. And it seemed like something that was just too good to pass up. So I made the jump from the insurance home office to ARRL headquarters, and as you mentioned, stayed there for 44 years.
And along the way, you became. Can you talk about what jobs you did until you actually became the CEO?
Sure. At first, there was actually one short stint when I worked in the lab in there just before going to work for the insurance company, but that's kind of a minor footnote. In May of 1972, when I joined the full-time staff, my title was assistant secretary, and one of my responsibilities was providing the administrative support for the International Amateur Radio Union, which I hope we'll have time to talk about a bit later. It was kind of a generalist position. We were expected to be able to answer just about any regulatory question that might come along, and any question about amateur radio internationally. So this was something I was pretty well versed in at that point. In a couple of years later, I started working on a master's degree in business administration in the evenings. And so by 1976, I had completed most of the coursework for an MBA. And the then general manager, Dick Baldwin, W1RU, decided he needed 2 assistant general managers, one for business operations, one for membership operations. And so he made me assistant general manager for membership. And that put me on track eventually in 1982 when Dick retired to be chosen by the board of directors as his replacement as general manager. By that time, I'd completed the MBA work. I had gone through the 1979 World Administrative Radio Conference, at which we were successful in defending amateur allocations and gaining some new ones. So I was entrusted with management of ARRL headquarters at the age of 32 in 1982.
Now, what's the difference between the CEO now and the general manager? Or were they the same position ultimately?
It's really the same position. The terminology in nonprofit organizations has evolved over time. There was a period of time when my title was executive vice president. Eventually, the board decided that CEO was more appropriate, and but they were essentially title changes, and not really anything else.
No additional responsibilities.
No, actually, the ARRL general manager was responsible for all headquarters operations, and that's the same for the CEO today. Actually, today there's one area of responsibility that has shifted away, and that's the position of Secretary of the International Amateur Radio Union. That's a position that I held from 1982 to 89 as part of my day job, and it's what I am now doing as a volunteer to stay connected to amateur radio now that I'm retired.
So you're representing the league now to the International Amateur Radio Union.
In effect, the ARRL, because it funds a good deal of the operation of IARU, the ARRL has the prerogative to appoint the IARU secretary. And so I was reappointed to that position in October 2016 after the service of another volunteer, Rod Stafford, W6ROD, a former ARRL president. And prior to that, another ARRL president, Larry Price, W4RA. Larry and Rod served as IARU secretary as volunteers, and so I'm kind of following in their footsteps after having originally relinquished the position to Larry back in 1989.
As a representative to the International Amateur Radio Union, what is its biggest challenge these days? Well,
the main focus of IARU, and I guess I should explain a little bit about what IARU is. It's the Worldwide Federation of National Amateur Radio Associations. So ARRL is a member on behalf of the United States. The Radio Amateurs of Canada is a member on behalf of Canadian radio amateurs. The Israel Amateur Radio Club represents Israel, and so on. There are more than 160 member associations of IARU, which is a federation. It doesn't have individual members. The main function of IARU is the protection of the radio spectrum for the use by radio amateurs. And this is protection both in terms of allocations, which are very important, of course, but also protection in terms of trying to minimize spectrum pollution, either by unauthorized stations operating in amateur bands or the sort of noise that afflicts anyone trying to use radio, especially on the lower frequencies, trying to avoid interference from sources like broadband over power lines, wireless power transfer is a current challenge. It's a fascinating field because it marries the need to understand the technology with the need to also understand a increasingly political environment at the international level. So it kind of circles back to my early academic education.
Did the league go through its largest growth spurt during your 44-year tenure? And why do you think that was, if it did?
No, it didn't. I would say the most dramatic growth spurt, although probably, if you go all the way back to the founding of the league in 1914, of course, the initial growth was very rapid percentage-wise. Perhaps not as impressive in terms of absolute numbers as today. The 1930s was a period of great growth for ARRL, also after World War II, and particularly the 1950s when the novice license, which, contrary to the opinion of my first instructor, actually was a great boon to amateur radio in the United States. So those were the periods of dramatic growth. We had pretty much matured as an activity by the time I took over. We did have growth. I left in April 2016. We had certainly more members than we did when we started out. When I started out, but I certainly couldn't claim any dramatic percentage growth because the league was already a mature association at that point.
The ARRL has its critics for maybe a host of reasons, because every person may think that the ARRL has a more specific role than it does. But what do you think was the most important role the ARRL had under your tenure?
Pretty much the same as IARU, spectrum protection. That's number one, first and foremost. When you think about the different activities that occur under the umbrella of amateur radio, you have very passionate, very enthusiastic people pursuing a wide variety of interests. And it stands to reason, it's human nature that if you're passionate about a particular facet of amateur radio, you're not going to feel that your national association, be it ARRL or any other in any other country, that the association is not devoting enough of its attention, enough of its resources to your special area of interest. And so that's where a good deal of the criticism comes from. I regarded it as I occupied the corner office. I regarded it as a happy problem. I worried a lot more. I worried a lot more when people were not passionate, were not pressing for more attention for their area. That's when you really have to worry. If you're just trying to balance available resources among competing interests, well, that's part of governance, and a certain criticism will always accompany that.
I want to take a minute to tell you about my favorite podcast, the Ham Radio Workbench Podcast, with George, KJ6VU, and now joined by Rod, VA3ON, Mike, VA3MW, Mark, N6MTS, and Vince, VE6LK. Every 2 weeks, George and company offer up a status report on the many amateur radio projects on their workbenches and explore projects on their guests' workbenches. This group is project active and prolific, covering many technical areas of amateur radio. So the next time you want a deep dive into ham radio electronic project building, or to learn about technology, tools, test equipment, construction techniques, and the rest, listen to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, available on every podcast player and channel. Use the link in this week's show notes page to get to the Ham Radio Workbench podcast directly. And now back to my QSO. With regard to spectrum protection, what can amateur radio operators do, in your opinion, to protect the spectrum that we have? It seems to me that this is a universal problem across the world. Certainly we have it here. And certainly homeowners associations seem to have really cut into amateur radio operations. But what can hams do in order to help protect the spectrum that we have?
Well, of course, homeowners associations is another dimension that is certainly part of it. and we can circle back to that. The IARU has a program called the IARU monitoring system, which goes under the popular designation of the intruder watch. And what the volunteers in this group do is that they keep track of signals that show up in the amateur bands that shouldn't be there. And there are quite a few of them, and some of them are a minor nuisance, and some of them are a major problem. But unless you keep track of these sources and, where appropriate, file complaints with your own administration, they'll just keep growing. The IARE Region 1 organization in particular is very effective in this area and is always looking for, worldwide, IARU is looking for volunteers with the sort of equipment that can help identify and locate sources of interference, of intruders into the amateur bands. Some of those are military. You're not going to do anything about those. Some of them are fishermen who just have a radio and use it to talk to other fishing boats, and there's a limit to how much you can do about that. But there have actually been some successes in that area. The other source, though, of interference that is certainly growing worldwide are the unintentional emitters, switching power supplies and wall warts and things like that, things that generate RF energy not as the intended function of the device, but just as an unwanted side product. And if they're not properly engineered, they can cause a lot of disturbance, especially in urban areas. That's certainly one of the big challenges that faces amateur radio globally. And as you mentioned, the fact that it's increasingly difficult to put up antennas where people are choosing to live. My daughter, for example, my daughter and son-in-law live in downtown Washington, D.C. There is simply no possibility that they would ever have an outdoor antenna in the condo that they have down there. When I visit down there, I think, well, if I were ever to live in such a place, I would have to operate a remote station, because there's just no way that you could do anything from the middle of a major city. And of course, the increasing urbanization of the world, the population is moving into urban areas, and so we're going to have to find other solutions, including remote stations, second homes, and so on.
As you look back on your tenure at the ARRL, is there anything that you wish that you could have done that you didn't do upon reflection? Or do you think that you pretty much did what you thought was the right thing all the way along?
Well, there was one initiative that I tried back in the 1980s. And if you go back into QSTs of the time, you'll even see a QST cover that had a architect's conception of what a amateur radio museum might look like. I had hoped that we would be able to build a real museum at League headquarters, but it turned out that there was just not enough support for the sort of funding that would be required to do it. So that never came to pass. I would say that in the mid-'80s, we did have what I regarded as a success in working with the FCC to develop something that was at the time called novice enhancement, of adding some additional privileges to the novice license. It actually turned out to be technician enhancement because it benefited the technician class license more. I regret that we did not and have not up until this time developed what would be an appropriate entry-level license for the 21st century. The novice license in the post-World War II era was certainly in my opinion, was an almost ideal medium for introducing young people to amateur radio. Today, the privileges that go along with the technician license are not the ideal way of introducing newcomers to amateur radio, young people in particular. We would need to have a HF digital dimension in order to be able to achieve that. And I wasn't able to do that. Another area, now that I think about it, was we were not able to get the amateur community and the FCC to get behind the idea of regulating the amateur HF spectrum on the basis of bandwidth rather than mode of emission. And today, with so many different modes being developed, it would just be more appropriate to regulate on that basis. But that's a work in progress, and I hope that my successor at ARRL will have better success in that regard.
Many of us who've been in ham radio for years have a mentor in Elmer, even still. I still have some. Do you have a ham radio mentor today, and who is it?
Gosh, I would have to say that in the microwave field, there are several guys, they all happen to be male, in New England, who have given Linda and me the benefit of their knowledge, and we very much value the time that we spend on the hilltops with them, and also talking to them from one place to another. I wouldn't want to embarrass any of them by mentioning specific names, but you will see their call signs on the work that they contribute to Microwave Update and other gatherings. Really, I would have to say at this point, I really can't say overall that I have a mentor today. I would hope to be able to perform that function myself in the future, and I am working with 2 high school radio clubs here in Connecticut to help the club advisors in each case to introduce a new generation to amateur radio, just as I was introduced to it 50-something years ago.
What kind of impact has amateur radio had on your family life?
I met my wife through amateur radio. We've been married 37 years. Our daughter has a license. She decided that at age 12 she wasn't going to let the boys at the middle school pass her up, so she decided she wanted to get a license before any of them ever did. It's given me an opportunity to travel with my wife, with my daughter back when she was young. She's 35 now, and travels on her own with her husband. But Linda and I have been able to meet amateurs in literally dozens of countries, and count among our closest friends people who we have met on our travels that have almost all been connected to amateur radio. Linda also, though, does volunteer election observation missions for an international organization, and that has taken her to some places that amateur radio has not. And I've been able to go along on a couple of those trips.
Do you travel with the radio?
Yes and no. Sometimes yes, sometimes no. The K3 packs very nicely into a backpack with a little power supply, and so I've operated that way from quite a number of countries. I've taken the FT-817 on QRP expeditions from time to time, but it's when we vacation in a place like the Dalmatian coast of Croatia, for example, I take the radio along not as a de-expedition, but just as something to keep me occupied. I'm not a beach person, so I'm much happier sitting in the shade, twiddling a keyer paddle.
That sounds like a great thing to do, especially there. What excites you the most about what's happening in amateur radio now?
Right now, I would say the development of digital modes, and in particular, the application to science investigation. I mentioned that for me, it all started trying to figure out how a radio signal got from near Cincinnati, Ohio, into my bedroom in southeastern Connecticut. And I was using a radio that did not even have a battery. It had no means of powering itself other than the signal that it was receiving from hundreds of miles away. That seed developed in me into a fascination with ionospheric propagation, and also along the way tropospheric propagation, which is of course what's mainly going on at microwave. But in particular, the ionosphere, the fact that the ionosphere has this incredible property that if you generate RF energy at certain frequencies, and it depends on the time of day and the time of sunspot cycle and the time of year, that energy will be propagated by the ionosphere literally all over the world. And that's a natural phenomenon. It has presumably always been there for as long as there has been an ionosphere. But it took the discovery of that. I like to say that radio was discovered, not invented. It took the discovery of that property to make global communication without wires possible. And so, to me, the ability that we now have to investigate, to document, to experience ionospheric propagation is so much greater than it was when it began, when I became interested 50-something years ago. And so applying these tools, reversebeacon.net as one example, applying those tools to gain a greater understanding of the ionosphere, of how that interacts with with other phenomena, other natural phenomena on our planet. I think that's very, very exciting, and I can imagine future generations retaining that fascination, because I believe in every generation there will be people who want to gain a clear understanding of the natural world around them, and radio is a big part of that.
What advice would you give to new or returning hams to the hobby?
Learn as much as you can. There is so much information available on the internet. You have to have a filter, but there's a lot of good information. The ARRL publications and those of other organizations and commercial organizations are just packed full of knowledge that you can apply to whatever passion you may have within the field of radio communication. And for a new generation, it will be different than it was for ours. For the baby boomers, the chance to talk to people all over the world was unique to amateur radio. It is, of course, not unique today, but the opportunity to explore the world of radio with like-minded people all over the world is still a unique part of the amateur radio service.
Dave, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the QSO Today podcast and hear from you. And I want to wish you good luck with the International Amateur Radio Union, and thank you for your service at the ARRL for all those years. And with that, I want to wish you 73. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eric. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I'll have to learn more about your own story, because all of us have a story in amateur radio, don't we?
We do indeed. Thanks so much. 73.
Okay, bye-bye.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Dave. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in K1ZZ in the search box at the top of the page. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor this or any of the episodes into written text, please contact me. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing on the subscribe buttons on the show notes page. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes pages. Your value for value support is recognized on the QSO Today podcast and in the weekly show notes. Use our Amazon link when you shop on Amazon. Clicking on this link before you enter Amazon will allow Amazon to pay us a small commission on what you purchase. This is a very painless way to support the QSO Today podcast. QSO Today is syndicated on every podcast platform, including Spotify and the iTunes Store. Until next time, this is Eric 4Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.